the idea that Christianity has a tradition about developing the spiritual senses is not very well known. In fact, my supervisor, the other day when I was on the phone to him looking at my proposal, he said, "I've never heard of this," and he's been a theologian for a long time, most of his life, and he's a retired professor now. And he hasn't heard of this tradition of developing the spiritual senses. But I wanted to broach it from a sort of, what I'm trying to do in my PhD is trying to find parallels of language, parallels not only of language but of practice, between what Rudolf Steiner brings in a sense of developing higher faculties of cognition, higher faculties of perception, which we can name, and I will name in the course of the evening, and a little bit on how one can go about doing that. But paralleling that to what's happening in theology at the moment in the world. So where is theology cracking open? Because Christian theology, especially Western Christian theology and Western religion, Western church at the moment is kind of under a storm of non-approval and of non-popularity and of being inflexible and being dominant in its doctrines and really not in a way incorporating or not moving with the times. And I'd like to shake that perception tonight a little bit, because in my research with theology at the moment is that there are some very exciting thinkers. And as I always say with the theological studies, is the problem is that most of the books remain on shelves in universities because people don't want to read theology, because why would you? But there's actually some really exciting stuff that happens if you're prepared to take the time to read it. And so one of the themes that I'm exploring for my PhD is it's the Christology of Rudolf Steiner. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to place Rudolf Steiner into a school. So the question, or we could say the rationale that I give for my PhD is that in theology and philosophy, not so much in education or farming, but in philosophy and theology, Rudolf Steiner is at best ignored. In one of the books, in fact this book here that I've got here, The Spiritual Senses, Sarah Coakley, who's the lady I'll be talking about tonight quite extensively, she says that this idea of the spiritual senses, at some point someone needs to go and explore the theosophical musings of Rudolf Steiner to see how they parallel with this. And that's how he features in theology. It's about the first book I've found him referenced in theology as a theosophical muser, which is fair enough. So the question for me is, why do people ignore Rudolf Steiner when we, possibly in anthroposophy, have read a lot and realize that for Steiner, it becomes more and more evident through his biography that the Christ, or the work of the Christ being, is central to understanding the evolution of our earth. It's also central to understanding the evolution of humanity and the evolution of consciousness. So that being so, you would imagine that he's got a lot to say that the theologians or the theological world would be interested in, but they're not. Why is the question? And partly it's in a sort of a brief way, what I'm positing is that he, up until about 1900, he's an up-and-coming academic. And then, for philosophy and theologians, he goes wonky, he goes esoteric, and they can't follow his step into his further teachings. The theologians of his time, they see him entering into the Theosophical Society, and 12 years later they don't get the step that he takes when he leaves the Theosophical Society in 1912, and he gives these beautiful lecture cycles on the letters of St. Paul, where he says, I actually want to change, or I want to make it very clear that my road to understanding and knowledge is not a nebulous mystical path of feeling. It's not a musing of theosophy. It is based on a very clear epistemology. But he places that epistemology basically means how do you come to know something. So this is one of the big things I think we need to change in theology, is to stop using big words that people don't understand. So I'm going to use a few of them tonight and give you sort of the English translation so that we don't get too lost. But how do I come to know something? How do I know what my thinking is telling me? What is the science of that? What are the lawfulnesses of that? And he says, I need to be very clear, people need to be very clear, that a spiritual scientific methodology that he promotes for understanding theological work is not based on what his contemporaries were doing. So you think of Rudolf Steiner's time, Albert Schweitzer was writing about the historical quest for Jesus. The beginning of the historical quest for Jesus, it starts with Albert Schweitzer, and it's into the fourth phase now. The third phase was the Mary Magdalene, Dan Brown sort of stuff, and there's a fourth phase now of the historical quest for Jesus. And Steiner at that point says, I need to tell you something very clearly, that trying to understand the Christ by analyzing historical criticism, by analyzing texts and trying to find the historical validity for Jesus is going to lead you to not knowing about it. And that's why they're still questing for it, because it basically leads to the fact that you're not going to prove it out of historical criticism, out of texts. And Steiner says, I want to base my knowledge, or I do base my knowledge on what he calls a Pauline theory of knowledge. So he says, my theory of knowledge, my way of coming to understanding, is exactly how Paul, who wrote the letters of in the New Testament, or in the Christian part of the Bible, and Paul basically never met Jesus. He didn't read any Bible. He didn't have any texts. But he had an experience. He had a spiritual experience, and that spiritual experience, he saw something. He had a light experience, and he asked this light. Don't forget, he was a highly prepared Jewish scholar who had been looking for the experience of the spiritual son, and he had it. There he was on his quest to stop all these Jesus people, and he met his spiritual fulfillment of his training. And he said, who are you? And he said, I am the one that you're persecuting. And with that experience, Rudolf Steiner says, and it's obvious from the texts, that he said, therefore I know Jesus existed. So he calls this a spiritual quest for the historical Jesus. Yeah, it is a spiritual quest for the historical Jesus, not a historical quest, or a quest for the historicity, but coming out of the experience of knowing the Christ as a spiritual being, having experienced it, the history and the validity of the texts in the Gospels are proven true. And Steiner says that again and again in his lectures about the Gospels. He says, I have gone into the spiritual world, I have seen these things, I have come to understand them, and I can show you that they make sense because it's also written in the Gospels, not the other way around. So it's a methodology that actually requires a person who is on a journey to develop a capacity to experience spirit. Now, we could say, well, how is that possible? And suddenly we open up a big realm of areas that we need to talk about. So when we look at that and we see how other people are looking at trying to understand these things, there is at the moment Professor Sarah Coakley. She's in Oxford at the moment. She's been in Cambridge and she's been in America, and she's been, I think, asked to leave a couple of universities because her work is quite radical, but she's wonderful. She's a wonderful thinker, and she has come to this same sort of question, as that if we look at systematic theology, so theology that looks at the text and says, the Bible can tell us this and this about Jesus, and it can tell us this and this about the Holy Spirit. So to draw all the various criticisms saying, from the texts we know this, she says that's not holding anymore. That's not how theology is going to go into the future. If we're going to go into the future, we have to look at the criticism against theology. And she names 3 criticisms, valid criticisms against theology at the moment. And the one is philosophical criticism is that, Christian or Western Christianity has tried to make God an object of all knowing and has claimed to know what God is. It's called ontotheology. So the ontotheology says we can know everything about God and we can tell you what that is, which in a way you can't. The other criticism then is that from a sort of sociological point of view is it's elitist. This group will dominate that group. Yeah, the church will be able to say who is saved or who isn't saved. So there's out of this kind of understanding, that's called hegemony, where this group is a better group than that group, and so there's exclusion. No one likes that anymore. That's got to change. And the third level, which I find is the area where we can start to come to understand how Steiner would approach this as well, is the realm of gender, where the symbology is phallocentric. Basically, God's a man, and that doesn't hold sway anymore either. We have to find new symbology, and a lot of work's been done on that. And if our old methods where the power structures around those three things of philosophy, sociology, and gender can be broken open with new methods within theology, which is what she's trying to work on, we can come to a better understanding or a better methodology to come to present our understanding of the spiritual world. And so she's promoting that we try to develop and bring back into focus the Christian tradition of developing the spiritual senses. Now that's quite radical, and a lot of, as my supervisor pointed out, a lot of the historical figures who are on the list of people who have explored the spiritual senses are kind of edgy people, as in the wrong side of the track. However, there's also some really pretty good names in there, like Aristotle, who wasn't Christian, and Plato, and Augustine, and Thomas Aquinas, and Luther, and Calvin, and Wesley, and Urs von Balthasar, and Bonaventure, and St. Francis. All of these people who are sort of mainstream Catholic saints have been talking about how do we create a sensorium of spiritual perception. They didn't create a full teaching of it, but they asked the question. So this is Sarah Coakley's work, and she asks this question. And it's a question for us to answer for ourselves. When the sacred text, so the Bible or another sacred text, says something like, "and you will see God," is that a metaphor or an analogy? So is that a metaphor or is that an analog? Let me sort of explain that a little bit. Metaphor would mean I've seen God because I had a great thought about God, so I've seen the light. That's a metaphor. You haven't actually seen God. Analogy would be, or an analog would be, I have developed within myself an analog set of senses to the 5 physical senses. I'm going to stick with the 5 senses at first because that's where most of the world still is. But you see, you smell, you hear, you taste, and you touch. And if you read through a lot of the scriptures, they say, you will be able to see God, you will be able to hear God, you'll be able to touch God, you'll be able to taste God even, and smell God. And is that just a metaphor for a sublime experience? Or are they analog senses that are dormant within us? You can see where we're already running very close to where Steiner starts to develop his work of higher senses. And she promotes that they are analog, and she promotes that all of these thinkers have proposed that there is a second set of senses that the human being needs to develop. Now the question then arises, are these a set of senses that you develop next to the physical senses? Or do you go through a process whereby you use the energy of your physical senses and transform out of that energy a higher set of senses? So for example, out of my eyes, through certain practices, I can develop a spiritual eye that eventually I can say, I see God. Now, I could be speaking about Rudolf Steiner's language in more secular terms, actually, at this point. It's exactly what he talks about, is how we have certain faculties within us, we have certain senses within us, that through certain practices, a higher sense of perception and a higher sense of cognition can develop. So these spiritual senses are something that has actually been around in Christianity, on the edge, but also ignored. Also not only ignored, but in a way kind of not developed, quite consciously not developed, because, well, if we look at the power structures of an institution, they would lose a lot of power if the people who belonged there suddenly could start to see God and didn't need people to tell them what God is. So, I mean, that we could just see that as possibly a kind of a suspicious kind of interpretation of church history, but I think it's fairly valid. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of communities that have gone down the track of being able to do these practices where they can actually begin to see the spiritual world. And so my endeavour in this is to try and draw these parallels between where we could say Western Christian theology has started a forum of discussion to not only explore what are the spiritual senses, but has already started to write how a doctrine of the spiritual senses has begun to develop through the last 2,000 years, but is requiring in a way a much more direct and formed, what we would call a doctrine. A doctrine isn't a dogma, just that we're aware of that. A dogma is a teaching that you can't question, because if you question, you discover no one knows what it means. Whereas a doctrine actually is similar to a doctor. It comes from the same word. It is a teaching that makes you healthy. So a doctrine, if you follow it and you understand a doctrine, it doctors you, it heals you. So a doctrine actually is a teaching that is open to change. It is open to new definition. It's open to new finding. It's scientific. It actually is open to reflection. It's open to criticism. It's open to saying that as we understand the world better and better through science and metaphysics, we will adjust this teaching. So a doctrine of the spiritual senses out of a Christian theology is actually quite an exciting proposition. It's also threatening for some people who want to keep the dogmas and the findings and the decisions that were made, say, in 400 AD with the patristic and the Chalcedon kind of doctrines about things. They want to keep that the way it is. However, things are cracking open. And part of that cracking open would be finding things like the Nag Hammadi library, the Qumran texts, where they've been taken, they've been worked through, they've been translated, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, Pontius Pilate, where we actually have texts, sacred texts on the table now, where we have to say that the canon of the church is no longer domain of a select group of interpretation, because there's more text on the table and it's cracked open the sense of people being able to hold hostage what it means and their understanding. It's become open. People like Elaine Pagels has done incredible work on bringing a Gnostic understanding, for example, of the teachings of Paul, and in our own sort of traditions, authors like Emil Bock, Friedrich Rittelmeyer, Rudolf Steiner himself have really contributed to saying that there are ways of understanding these texts that are not just literal and historical in their criticism. But how do we actually come to develop this possibility, this kind of thing? And Sarah Coakley is very interesting, because she, what would you think of for yourself? How do I go about, if we just sort of leave Rudolf Steiner's work out of it, how would one ask a person to develop out of their current sensorium, the physical sensorium, an analog set of senses? What would one do? what will one do? I mean, if we're just sort of thinking of mainstream thinking or it's very the traditional set of thinking, what are the things that one could come up with that would be able to develop a way where we can begin, one, to have an experience of spirit, and two, to be able to communicate that experience in a way that another person can understand it rationally. I mean, John did a interesting job of his experience, but I mean, if you read the Apocalypse of John, sometimes it's kind of like, what? That's hard to understand. You might have got it, but I've got to really work at getting what you mean. So when we start to go into this realm of mystical experience, of going inward to bring my inner experience and that of spirit into a way of communicating those pictures to the human being, it becomes very interesting. Because as soon as I say, well, you know, I was in the spirit this morning and I was talking to the Archangel Michael and he said this to me, you'd all go, really? How do I know that that's not just Martin making stuff up? That's the problem of spiritual experience, is that at this point it's limited and it's personal. It's very coloured by my experience of it. And so is there a way of, and this is what I'm trying to write about in my PhD, is there a way where we can develop what Steiner calls a spiritual scientific methodology that can hold its own ground with positivist science? So where you can go, this is an experience, this is how it is, these are the laws. I mean, Rudolf Steiner talks about science. Science just means knowing. So scientia means I know in Latin. And science, in Steiner, he gives the definition of science as pertaining to a lawfulness in his theory of knowledge. He says science means something that pertains to a lawfulness. So I understand the law of something. So we can understand physics, we can understand chemistry, we can understand mathematics, we're coming to understand history, we're starting to understand the psyche of the human being, we're starting to define how that works. But when we get then into the sort of suprasensible, what is the law of God? Well, that's called theology, the knowing of the divine, theology. Is that a science, or is that just people making things up and saying this is how it is? And so we need to develop a way of coming to understand these things. And Sarah Coakley, there are traditions with that. In the old days, there are the old church traditions. In the West, it was known as purgation, purification, illumination, and initiation. If we were in the Eastern Orthodox Church, it would be kenosis, emptying out, photismos, the enlightenment, and theosis, the divine making of the human being. These are the three principles that are known in traditions, also beyond Christianity. They go into ancient pre-Christian traditions. And if we look at, I'm going to make a jump into Rudolf Steiner's work with that. If we look at Rudolf Steiner's work, you'll see that he wrote a very interesting book known as The Philosophy of Freedom, which is a slightly new methodology than that. Because he really goes to say that in the human being, when we have a thought, it's not just a thought, but it's also the apprehension of the essence of the thing in itself. In the human being's thinking, there is a world behind the thought, and the two can be perceived in one. You can have the thought and the perception of the noumenon, the thing in itself, the spiritual entity. And in thinking in the human being, that comes the closest together. And he wrote through The Philosophy of Freedom a way of doing that. And then a bit later, he renewed the old pathway of the purgation, the illumination, and the unity, the three steps of that, in a book called Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. If you read Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, its chapters take you through that. Preparation, enlightenment, initiation. It's a renewal of that old path through ascetic practices, philosophy will say brings the new path first, and then he renews the old path after that. So there's many, many paths that Rudolf Steiner takes us on to be able to start to develop these higher senses. Sarah Coakley is, much more in a sort of mainstream Western church, and trying to renew how we can go about as a human being, everyday human being, with no special claim to anything. Is it possible for me to go a pathway whereby I can, in my current understanding, in my current way of life, I can start to develop this transformation of the physical senses within ourselves? And she says there is. And I think in this sense she also accords with where Rudolf Steiner goes with it. And she says the simplest method is prayer. Silent prayer, contemplative prayer. And she says if we want to change the methodology of how theology comes about, if we want to change this power structure within the churches, we need to go into new forms of philosophy. And so we need to go from knowing what God is, and let's not fool ourselves, anthroposophy is very much a knowing world. If there's a question, everyone's already got an answer. There's no unknowing in anthroposophy. I mean, there is, but we don't tend to give it a lot of space. So she says we need to step into unknowing. So the methods of unknowing. So where we make ourselves vulnerable to what she calls divine interruption. So you can be pondering something and you have to be open that suddenly you're going to have an insight that you don't already know. So if we fill ourselves with answers, we're not going to be in this silent receptivity. And through this practice, through a lifetime, we can move through this, what she calls contemplative prayer. And it's not a new practice, contemplative prayer, silent prayer, centering prayer, mindfulness. It's all the buzz right now in the world is quieten your mind and be open, center yourself. But in this process, something else can happen. And again, she would turn to the Bible and she asks the question, what does it mean just after Easter when the Christ has kind of risen from the dead, and there's these two people on the road to Emmaus, and they have a meal with him in the evening. And I think it's that point where it says, and he opened their mind. He opened their understanding and they could see. What does that mean? If we take it almost literally, it means that if we do these practices, these practices of prayer and other things over time, we create a space for the Christ to work a transformative process within our sensorium. Now, some people might not be happy with the word Christ or Jesus, but we could say that in a sense of the Goethean process of understanding how an organ of perception develops. Goethe made the observation, for example, that the eye, our eye, was developed by the light to see the light. So when there is something to be apprehended, it works upon the life body of a being and develops within that being an organ of perception. So we could say that the spiritual world, the spiritual reality behind or within, or that is the formative reality behind nature phenomenon or the natural phenomenon, work upon us in such a way, if we allow it, that the senses that we need to perceive it will develop. However, we need to be active in that. We need to be actively inactive. Yeah, so contemplative attention, she calls it. And there's three steps to this. So the purgative step to it that she develops is the first step, which is where you decide to differentiate your life from your secular life. So in the old days, when this is back in Roman days, when a person became a Christian, they didn't go to the Circus Maximus anymore. because the Circus Maximus gave you impressions that you didn't need to have anymore. You made a decision to withdraw your sensorium from certain things so that you could allow an emptiness to appear within it, and you had to change your lifestyle. You had to actually purge yourself of certain things. But to do that, you had to set yourself aside a little bit. Some people went into the monastic life with that. But you had to set yourself aside and say, I'm actually going on a path of schooling here, and this life will be separate from that life that I've always led before. And, you know, there's been extreme examples of that, like the Cathars that were mentioned. But you can also and Steiner's very clear about this, today we need to be able to do it in everyday life. We live in a world where going into a monastery is good for some, but not all of us can go into a monastery. So we need to be able to do this sitting on the train or the railway station at town hall. We need to be able to do it at a red light. We need to be able to do it while making coffee in the morning. So we need to not allow our secular life to dominate, but we also at the same time need to not withdraw from it completely. So that's the first step. The second step that she takes with this is that she wants us, or asks us, now where did I write this down? Is that the second step is that she then goes down the track of saying that when we start these practices, I'm just going to have to reconstruct this because I'm not going to be able to read that because I haven't got my glasses on. And are those readers?
They're just readers.
Are they just readers?
Just
Thank
readers.
you. That'll help. Oh. They're very strong readers, Lisa. Where does she go with that second step? Is that she asks us to... Yep, there we go. That we then start these practices. So we take the first step, we delineate between the spiritual life and the secular life. And certain things in our life become forsworn. So we promise not to partake in certain sensations. So like not going to the Circus Maximus or not partaking of certain things. So that's the beginning of certain ascetical development that we take, and that's called what she calls public creed. We make a public declaration, I now belong to this life. So we could say, I become a Catholic, or I become an anthroposophist. I'm going to undertake a certain delineation in my discipline in my life, not to allow my senses, my taste. I might have to stop eating certain foods or things so that I can slowly empty out the desire from my senses. Then the second step is where the creeds, so the creeds of the organization that you join, so the teachings, say, of anthroposophy, or the creed of the Catholic Church, or whatever it is that you're joining, they don't just become a tool of judgment anymore. So they're not just a list of things by which I can judge this group is better than that group. So that's the second step. So the first one was like a philosophical step. The second one is the social step, where the creed has to become a rule for my life. So a rule is not necessarily a great word, but it becomes a way of life. So the practices are not dictated to me by this and that society, but they become something where my practices infuse my beliefs with greater meaning or richer meaning. So I believe that there is, say, a spiritual world that is formative, that dreams into creation. And if I do these practices, that becomes richer for me as I do these practices. So there's a kind of not only just I've made these rules up and I've pulled myself back, now suddenly these beliefs start to become richer. And then through this contemplative attention to this richer life, and through this silent prayer and what she calls empty awaiting, again, not a new concept, empty awaiting, is in the Bible. Mary does these things, this pondering in one's heart. And through this contemplative attention, our belief can become knowing. And through that, through that, this metamorphosis can take place by allowing the spiritual world to be present in myself. An energy of the physical senses is taken and is transformed into a higher sensorium. So that's kind of where she's working in mainstream Western theology, is to say that if we start doing this, we will be able to speak about theology in a completely different way. We will be able to speak about Trinity. We'll be able to speak about the human condition and the relationship between the human condition and the divine condition in completely different ways. Because we will also be able to begin to experience it. We will be able to begin to speak out of our experience of the divine. So now I want to sort of try and find a parallel with that with Rudolf Steiner. I mean, for most of us, or for some of us, that may already be obvious where some of that is. But it would be quite interesting to sort of see where he goes with his idea. So one of the ideas that Steiner brings is that the first chapter of anthroposophy, and let's rename that word again. I like to rename it as human-wrought wisdom, but if it's literal, it's human wisdom, or wisdom of the human being, or a wise understanding of what it means to be a human being. But if we take it as a verb, it is wisdom that is wrought by me wrestling with what it means to be a true human being. So again, it's an inner process of wrestling with my human condition to bring about my higher humanity into my social life, into my works. And Steiner says the first chapter of that is to understand the senses, how the senses work, the world that unites us with the physical world. We need to understand that. And without going into too much detail, he develops the sensorium that we have for the physical world beyond the 5 senses. And some of it's obvious for people who haven't heard of the 12 senses that he develops before. But he says 7 of these senses lead us out into the world, teach us about the world outside of us. And 5 of these senses help us perceive what's going on inside of ourselves. I was wondering if I could borrow your glasses again, Lisa. Because I never can remember these things in the right order. And in this particular lecture that he gives these 12 senses in a slightly different order. This is the lecture of the 8th of August 1920 in the Collected Works 199, which is spiritual science and its work as a social sciences or something. And he develops the 7 senses that lead us into the world out there as taste. So you can see how taste is on an edge where we take the outer world in a little bit, but it still teaches us about the world out there. And then sight, warmth, which is interesting because in other lectures, warmth would be one of the senses that we teach about what's going on in me. And then hearing, and then he develops, these are senses, so if you haven't heard about these senses before, it's worth just listening to them and saying, oh, do I have a sense of warmth? I mean, taste, sight, we know. A sense of warmth. Well, I know when the environment's cold. So yes, warmth teaches me, I have a sense. Yesterday was really cold. I needed a jumper. So I had a sense for that. I didn't need to read the website to tell me that it was cold. Hearing. So we have a sense of hearing, sound, music plays into that, but we also can hear the screech of a bird or the song of a bird or an animal, and we can understand that sound. But that sound also then works into word. So a word sense comes on the top of sound, which is different. So we can hear a person who's in pain, groaning, and we understand something. But if they swear and tell us how they're feeling, we understand something else of it. And then behind the word, or higher than the word, is the sense of thought. So again, that might be a bit of a confronting idea, that a thought isn't something that I think, but my brain is the perceptive organ for the thought world. These are all lectures in themselves, but just take that for a moment. And then we also have a sense of ego or self. So I can sense in another being if it's got a self or not. It's a sense. I can look at someone and I can see if they're present or not. So, I mean, I don't know if you've sort of been giving talks or talking with someone, you can see they're not present. They're off on their own world. People tell me I do that a bit. I mean, drift off when they're talking to me. So those are the ones, those are the 7 that kind of take us into the world out there. The other 5 tell us something about what's going on the inside of me. So the sense of life, the sense of movement, my sense of balance, my sense of touch. So touch is again boundary, a boundary between out there and inside me, but my skin starts to tell me about inside me. And then the sense of smell. So smell, touch and smell are kind of boundaries between inside and outside, along with taste. Now Steiner says these senses, in a way, have developed over time. And if we look at the history of things, we could say, well, why have we lost these spiritual senses? And I'm saying that quite consciously. Have we lost the spiritual senses, or we have not developed them? If we listen to the indigenous cultures, we've lost them. Western bodies have lost the spirit that keeps us awake. And I like to say we've forgotten what we've forgotten in the West. If you go into indigenous cultures, Scandinavian countries, indigenous cultures, they can still dream. I can remember a conversation with an Aboriginal man in Adelaide, and we were talking about a particular process that we were doing as some sorry business together, and I wanted to do a little art sculpture there. And he said, why do you need to do art? You don't change things. He said, well, I need to do that. And he said, why? I said, well, I need to know that what I've done here stays here. And afterwards he said, thank you, I've learned something. He said, I didn't realize that white men don't know how to dream anymore. You need art processes to feel how you've impacted upon the environment. So we use art possibly as a way of realizing that what's lived in me is now out there in the world and remains there when I leave. And the indigenous people just know because they see it. They see their dream in the environment. We don't have that anymore. And Steiner actually says that's an important process in history where we have had a clairvoyant or a knowledge of the spirit, and with time that has shrunk down. He kind of says that there was a time where that was in our life body, and then that was given to our children, and the life body was a little bit smaller, and then it became a little bit smaller. And through the generations, the capacity for seeing spirit became more and more confined into these physical senses for seeing the world. And that was really important, because if we kept seeing the spirit, we would not individuate. We would not be able to sit here as completely individualized individuals. We would feel one with the whole group. And it is from that point where the veils have come down. So if we go back to the Isis mysteries, Isis was veiled and she said, no one should lift my veil. The young initiate, the young man at Zeiss, lifted the veil and got into a lot of trouble for that because it was too early. Later on, Parsifal, who means to see through the veil, changed the mystery, because now it's time, 14th, 15th century, where the veils over the spiritual world are so strong that we need to lift the veils by developing these senses within us. And Steiner says through the practices of these 12 senses, we can build another half or another part, so we can transform the physical sense into a higher cognition and a higher imagination. And I'll just go through some of these. So, for example, he says when we transform through certain practices, we can transform our sight into a faculty that he calls imagination. Now, that's not fantasy or science fiction. It is the capacity for us to perceive the reality of spirit in images. So this is where I find he comes very close to Sarah Coakley, because she says that when we look at the new kind of theology that needs developing, we will need to use a new form of symbology. So not just phallocentric symbology, but symbols. We would need to find fuller symbols and really understanding how a symbol takes us to knowledge and not just an intellectual phrase or an intellectual dogma. We'll have to live into a picture, into an image, and by studying that image, we will start to find what it means. So the use of art and imagery as a really big part of the first step towards a new theology and a new science. So Steiner says that's the first step, and we need to really build the capacity to image things before we go into mystical depths. If we don't know how to hold an image and just step into mysticism, we could go into a lot of harmful kind of ways. Then he says if we transform our hearing, so when we start to hear word, noise, music, when we do enough practices on that, we will start to have inspiration and be able to hear what Pythagoras and himself called the harmony of the spheres. So behind the image world of the spirit, there is an order of things that appears to us in musical forms. And musicians, composers, they try to bring some of that. When you ask, when a person has composed something, so when a person paints something, they've tried to image something. When they compose things, they are also bringing something that they hear. What is that? What is that capacity to hear something? It might not be physical hearing, but it is the transformation of the eustachian tubes and the hearing faculties into those who have ears, let them hear, as it says in the Bible. Let those who have ears to hear, let them hear behind the image the ordering of music that orders the world. And then when we get to things like what's behind the word, the thought, if we transform that, we will come to the essence, as Sarah Coakley calls it. We will take our belief into being in union with the essence of that knowledge. And Steiner calls that the intuition, is when we are in union with the spiritual, the noumenon. We can come to know the noumenon by developing these higher faculties, but they are transformed out of our seeing. They are transformed out of our human capacity. They don't come from something that we are not. That's the important thing. Both Sarah Coakley and Rudolf Steiner are saying these faculties don't come, they're not suddenly things that an angel comes and plonks something in us. We can work out of our human capacity, we can work on our everyday understanding and our everyday practices, and the Spirit will then work into the substance or the energy that we build through our prayer and our meditations and our imaging, and that will bring about a metamorphosis, an analogue of a perception. If we went to the East, we would call that an opened chakra. Yeah, so the third eye, or the chakra of the heart, where we can start to perceive these other things. So there is also an Eastern tradition of these things. Then Steiner says that's not the end of it. There's more than just those three. But he says if we then also work on the senses that take us into ourselves, the ones that go into ourselves, he goes through a bit of a list with that and talks about how if we work on the senses inwardly, so this is a bit of a mystical path now that we go on with that, we start to develop inner senses that have to do with things like the feeling of well-being. That moves into the feeling or experiencing my soul nature as free of the body. We also come to, instead of balance, we can come to an inner rest where we feel ourselves as a spiritual being. So I'm not just Martin in a physical body, but I actually have a spiritual being. I can start to feel that. And then I can start to feel where I'm permeated or I'm touched by God, and eventually we can come to a sense, a new organ of perception that's called the mystical union with the divine. So the mystical union becomes a sense organ, a way of cognition, when we transform the inner senses. So there's a huge amount of work for us to be able to do. Steiner gives many indications on how to do that. Some are very complicated and some are really simple. So for example, he gives a meditation is easy enough to follow, which is known as the meditation of the Rose Cross. People may know it. There's books downstairs you can buy on it. There's many years you can spend doing it. But he talks about this is the first step where we take not just a scientific path where I look to the world and say, that's a thing in itself, and we come to this plurality of energy by going into the world around us. Or we can go on the mystical path inwards and we say all is one. There's just this unity, this blissful unity. And he says as a modern person, Those two pathways are possible, but they don't actually bring us to knowledge. We need to go both paths. We need to bring them together. And so he says the first step is we need to take pictures from nature, pictures from the world around us, and create a symbol, which is exactly where Sarah Coakley lands, to create new symbols. And the picture of the rose cross is a symbol, and then allow that to enter into us mystically. So to go inward with it, but only once we've brought the symbols together out of the physical world. So we have to go outwards into the world of the phenomenon, bring the phenomenon together in a new way, in a symbol, so through an artistic process, and then allow some inner pondering to come together, where I allow the feelings that arise with me, and that allows us to, that work creates a transformation of my eyes into the spirit eye for imagination. And then there's a second step with the rose cross and a third step with the rose cross that one can do, that would probably just go beyond the step of this lecture for this evening, but it's all there in the lectures that one can read about it. So we're 4 minutes to the end of the lecture, and I think I might stop there just to say that the work that I'm discovering is that there are things happening in the world, there are things happening in theology where, and Steiner said this would happen, that the stuff that he talked about will start to appear, that if we talk about anthroposophy as the new inspiration of Michael, he says, the Anthroposophical Society doesn't have a stronghold on anthroposophical knowledge. There are many people who are at work with it, and there are things that are happening in theology where I see a kind of a path or a methodology for another way to theology, and another way of understanding the work of Christ in history, out of mainstream contemplation and out of what we call spiritual scientific contemplation. They're starting to meet and they're starting to have a conversation, and I suppose that's where I'm doing my work, and hopefully we'll be able to have some more talks about this in the not too distant future.